Hello and welcome to the Warehouse Management series. This session is about the cluster picking, and we're going to review how to process and configure the cluster picking in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management. So, what is the cluster picking? The cluster picking is a piece picking process that lets you pick multiple items for multiple sales orders at the same time during one travel to the picking locations. Typically, the cluster picking is used with small order picking or quantities that are less than case quantities, and usually it is managed by something like this picking card, where every position here in the picking card should be linked with a work order. And now the question is, how the cluster picking works and where is the business value of using the cluster picking? In order to answer this question, let's imagine that you have three sales orders for the same item. And now let's compare the normal sales order picking process by the cluster picking process. So first, with the normal sales order picking method, the picker will go to pick the first order and then back to the packing station or the pay door to place the item there. And then to go back again to pick the second order that probably would be at the same location. And then the third order and so on. But when it comes to the cluster picking, the system will group the items that should be picked in this cluster and then ask the picker to pick the specified quantity for the three orders together, and then suggest placing the specific quantity of every work at the targeted position in the picking cart. So here the picker will go to pick the item for the three orders together at the same time during one travel to the picking location, which is definitely will reduce the travel time across the warehouse and will increase the order picking efficiencies. Now let's summarize this process step by step. So the process initially starts by releasing the sales orders to the warehouse. So the picker or the supervisor can either cluster the orders manually by assigning every work to a targeted position, or it could be also automatically. In the manual cluster creation process, typically every position in the picking cart will be labeled with a position code. This position code could be alpha, like A, B, C, or it could be also numeric, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So you can assign the work to a targeted position using the work ID and the position name or the position code. The process of creating the cluster and assigning the works to the positions could be also automatically based on system predefined rules. Like for example, you can group the works together into a cluster picking using delivery date, picking zones, or for example, order origin. This is called system directed cluster picking. After creating the cluster, the warehouse management mobile app will suggest the items that should be picked first based on the sorting rule and the targeted positions that you should place the item there. After picking the items, the cluster will be closed and the items should be moved either to the pack station or to the bay door as per the business process. Just to make it more clear, let's see a quick demonstration on how the cluster picking works in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management. So assuming that there are three sales orders, where the first sales order requires one each from item A, one each from item B, and the sales order number two requires two each from item A, and the sales order number three requires one each from item A, one each from item C. So as a summary, we're gonna pick four eaches from item A to be allocated for the sales order number one, two, three, and one each from item B, which is for the second sales order, and one each for the item C for the sales order number three. So I have created three sales orders. The first one that ends with 58. This is one each of item A and one each of item B. Then the second sales order, two eaches of item A, and the third sales order is one each of item A and one each of item C. Then I have released the three sales orders and I got three works here, where every work is represents a sales order. So if you're gonna review the first work here, so the first work, this is for the first sales order. So this is one each of item A that should be pegged from location 001, and one each of item B that should be picked from location 002. And then when you pick the items, you should put it in the location pack station. And then the second work, this is two eaches of item A from location 001, and the last work, one each of item A from location 001 and one each of item C from location 003. Now let's move to the warehouse management mobile app to start building the cluster. I'm assuming that the picking cart that I'm gonna use in this demonstration contains only three positions. This means that this picking cart can only fulfill three works. As clarified in the presentation, the step of building or creating the cluster could be manually or automatically. So right now in the warehouse mobile app, I have two menu items for the cluster creation. I have create cluster. This is the manual one. And I have system directed cluster create. So the system directed cluster create will automatically link these three works to the three positions. Later on in the configuration step, I'm gonna clarify how to use and configure the system directed cluster picking. But in this step, I'm gonna use the create cluster. So I can manually assign the works to the available positions. So I'm gonna click here, create cluster. This is the cluster ID. The cluster ID has been automatically generated. This is a configuration point, so you can specify whether the cluster ID should be automatically generated or if you would like to specify the cluster ID manually. So this is the cluster ID. This is the position. This is the first position. And right now I should assign a work to this position. So I'm gonna copy the work ID here. In real scenarios, you can just scan the work ID from the work printout to be assigned to this position. So I have assigned this work to the first position, and I'm gonna copy this to be assigned to the second position. And I'll copy the third work to be assigned to the third position. So right now I have this cluster that already linked with the three works right now. Moving from the cluster creation step to the picking step, right now the picker should pick four eaches of item A from location 001. I can continue with the picking process right now using this menu item. However, in real life, the one who will create the cluster, not necessarily that he will be the same person or same worker who will perform the picking process. If this is the situation, so probably the warehouse supervisor will create the cluster, then he will pass the cluster so the picker can pick this cluster ID once again and start the picking process. So if I click right now, pass, this cluster will be passed. If I go right now, let's go and check. So here in the warehouse management, work outbound, work clusters, you will see this is our cluster ID that linked with the four works. So you'll observe that this cluster is not logged by anyone. So as a picker right now, I can use another menu item, which is, for example, here cluster pick. I will here enter the cluster ID and then start the picking process. So this is a business process. If it does one step, so the picker will create the cluster and then will keep the picking. We can use it one shot using the first menu item, create the cluster and then start picking. Okay. So right now this is the picking step. So I should pick four eaches of item A from location 001. This is the confirmation step of the quantity. I'm gonna enter here four eaches. Then I should right now put one each into position number one, which is for the first work. And as a validation step, the warehouse app is ask me right now to enter the position ID for validation. So I'm gonna scan the position. This is position one. And then put two eaches to position two and one each in position three. Okay. And then let's move to the second item. So the second item is item B. I should pick one each and put in location 001. I'm confirming the pick quantity 1, and then I'll put this into position number 1. So for sure, if I enter incorrect position like 2, so the system will throw this error message. So I'm gonna enter here the correct position, which is 1. So I have picked the first item, item A, and the second item, item B, and right now I should pick the item C. But suddenly I figure out that the position number 3, which supposed to be used for the work number 3, is full. So the picker can just click position full here and mark which position is full, which is 3. So right now here, this is the current quantity left to pick. It is 1 each, but I cannot fulfill any quantity anymore. So I'm gonna say here 0. So right now, what the system did, if we gonna go to the work number 3, you will see that it has been splitted. So the work, if you remember, if we go here to the sales order, so we had one work for item A and item C. If we check right now item A, you will see that the work of item A, the pick step has been already closed, and the system split the work to keep the work of item C open. So I can create another cluster, or I can pick this work manually later on. So let's go back to close and complete the cluster. So right now, this is the cluster. I'm gonna close this cluster. This is position 1, 2, 3. I should put the quantity to the location backstation. I'm gonna click OK, and the cluster completed. Right now, if I click refresh, let's check, for example, any of the other 3 works. If I check this work, for example, you will see that now the pot step is already closed and the items moved to the back location. This is the remaining work. I can manually pick this work or add it to another cluster picking. Now let's review and highlight the required configurations for the cluster picking. I'd like first to highlight that some of the features that you just saw in the previous presentation are managed by a feature management. Like the full option is managed by a cluster position feature, and the system directed cluster picking are managed by 2 features, the organization wide system directed work sequencing and the system directed cluster picking. For the rest of the configurations, I have configured a normal work template and location directives for the targeted warehouse. Then moving to the specific configurations for the cluster picking, which is the cluster profile. So here in the warehouse management setup, mobile device cluster profiles, I have defined 2 cluster profiles. The first one to create the cluster itself, and the second one is to manage the picking process. So here, this is the one that should create the cluster. I define cluster profile ID called create cluster, where the cluster type is picking. And then in the general tab, I set generate cluster to yes. So this will automatically generate number sequence for the cluster picking. If you set this to no, so this definitely the user should enter the cluster ID manually. So this is makes sense, for example, for the cluster picking scenario. So if you have a specific menu item for the picking process, this one should have generate cluster equal no. So the user will just enter the cluster ID that already created and then keep the picking process. And then in the activate positions, I set this to yes. So I will manage the position names. So here in the position name, I can specify the position names, numeric like 1, 2, 3, or alpha, ABC. If I set this to no, then the target license plate will be used instead of the position names. Then in the number of positions, I have 3. That means that With every cluster picking, I will have three available positions. Then this is the step when the cluster should be break. So I set this to work close. You can also break the cluster with the pot step. And then in the sort verification type, I set this to position scan. This is the step when the mobile app will validate if the position which is the user is put the items is the correct position or no. So the user should scan the position name to validate that this is the targeted position. You can set this to license plate scanning, so the user should scan the target license plate, or you can set this to none, so no validation will occur. The rest of the configurations are related to the cluster put away. And then moving to one of the important configuration, which is the cluster sorting. And the cluster sorting criteria control the order in which the worker will perform the picking work. So I set this here based on the WMS location ID. So the sorting will be based on the available locations. So this is the configurations of the cluster profile. Okay, and now let's move to the mobile device menu items. Actually, I have created four menu items, two for the manual cluster picking and other two for the system-directed cluster picking. For the manual cluster picking, the first menu item here is the create cluster. This is use existing work and directed by cluster picking. And I linked this to a cluster profile ID here, create cluster. The other one for the picking process, it is the same. It is also use existing work directed by cluster picking, but it is associated with cluster profile ID cluster picking, which is not generating a cluster ID. The other option here also is the generate license plate. I set the generate license plate to yes. However, for the scenarios where the license plate should be reused, like the scenarios of using the tot ID to be used in the packing station, so you should set this to yes. Then when you build the cluster picking or process the cluster picking, you can scan the tot ID as a target license plate, then you can use it later in the packing station. For the system-directed cluster picking, I have created a normal menu item as the cluster create, where the use existing work equal yes, and it is directed by system-directed cluster picking. Then I link this to a normal cluster profile ID, create cluster, and then I set generate license plate equal yes. So far, this is somehow like the normal cluster picking, but the additional configuration here is the system directed work sequence queries, which is managed the way on how the work or the criteria where the works will be automatically assigned to the available positions. So here in the uh, system-directed queries, I have defined a query here called work ID, and here in the edit query, you can define the criterias. So I have two conditions here where the sales origin should be ecom and the requested ship date on today. So let's validate how this works. If I go back right now to the mobile device, let's click SD cluster create. So if I click this right now, I'll receive this info message where no available works. This is in general means that no available works to be assigned. This could be a criteria that have not been met or works, for example, that are less than 3 works, which is the option that we have here in the number of positions. Okay, I have a sales order is ready. I'll select here in the sales origin ecom. The sales order has 3 lines with 3 works. So right now, if I go back to the mobile device and then click SD cluster create, then the system will automatically build the cluster. Let me pause this. Let's go back to the work clusters and click refresh. So this is the cluster that the system has been built. So this is for the 4 works that we have. So this was a quick demonstration that showing the process and the configurations of the cluster picking in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management. Thanks for watching and your time. Reach out if I can help. Take care and good luck.